Well, as people start to flowing in, I'll start a short introduction. So welcome everyone to our last episode of the webinar series of CADRE talk by our fellows. Just a brief mention of the platform. We are a bibliographic data sharing platform built on cloud, providing easy to use search interfaces as well as computational environment for reproducible computation on bibliographic related research. We recently launched our beta version. You can check out the recording. With it, we have launched new query engines, and user data will be now persistent from this point on. And there are a few other updates, so check us out. We also need a lot of feedback since we are still improving the platform. So you can reach us at different channels. Our partners are growing. Recently, University of Toronto just joined us. So it's a growing pool of researchers, and we hope this community can keep growing, and activities of shared and collaborative research is another big goal of this project. We're now offering a free trial, so check us out. If you are from an institution that currently has no paid service, you can get more information from this URL. We want to acknowledge our funding support from Institute for Museum and Library Services, and our data support from Web of Science and Microsoft. And I'll launch a simple poll for attendees. Take a couple seconds for you. I'll launch it here. So it's been quite eventful 2020 for CADRE. Alpha launch, beta launch. Our fellow teams has been quite active throughout the year. Despite the pandemic, our webinar series has been constantly bringing content and what our fellow teams been doing with our data set. Just a brief overview, recap of last couple months. The team from University of Michigan in September, IU team, the Warsaw team from Europe in October, Michigan team again in November, and today, last but not least, our team from Purdue University, leading by Michael Witt, who is a associate professor at the Librarian School for Information Studies at Purdue University. He's also the interim associate dean for research. Their project is about utilizing data citations for aggregating, contextualizing, and engaging with research data in STEM education research. So it's really connecting the graph data set that we host on CADRE to actual research data. So I'm very curious what they're going to be talking about today as well. This team also joined by Lauren Catlin Parker and Anne Batcher. I think Michael will give a much better introduction of his team, so I'll leave that to him. And I think without further ado, I'll stop sharing here. Mike, you can take the screen now.
Thank you, Shiran. Okay, can you hear me? Can you see me okay? All right, fantastic. So it's really a pleasure to be here today. We appreciate all of the support from IU, from IUNI that we've gotten in collaboration with the IMLS and with the Big Ten, with the Web of Science group and Microsoft Research as part of this CADRE endeavor. And so The title of our talk is Utilizing Data Citation for Aggregating, Contextualizing, and Engaging with Research Data in STEM Education and Research. So the team that we have here at Purdue is a multidisciplinary team. So I come from the libraries and School of Information Studies. My graduate student, Pranav Kumar Aditya, is on a second year of a master's degree in electrical and computer engineering and has been doing most of the coding and data analysis for us. My colleague Lauren Parker at the Evaluation Learning Research Center at Purdue has been providing the domain expertise from STEM education research as a STEM education researcher herself. And then Ann Bessenbacher is the cyber infrastructure expert who works primarily with STEM Ed Hub, which you can visit at stemedhub.org, where they have really a ton of resources and dynamic content and ability to interact with the community of research and a practice around STEM education research at stemed.hub. So this is our team. We're the CADRE Fellows team from Purdue. To give you an idea of what we'd like to talk about for the next half hour or so, this is our outline. I'm going to start with an introduction and a little bit of context. I'm going to tell you the main finding of our research right up front, so you don't have to wonder about it. After the introduction, I'll pass it off to Lauren, and Lauren will give us a little more of an orientation to the domain of STEM education research and what their attitudes and approaches to data currently are among researchers in that domain. I'll take the baton back and talk about the study that we did looking at publications, journal publications in STEM education research. We'll look at data policies that are associated with those, a sample of them, and then dig into our actual data collection and analysis using Web of Science data. And then we'll conclude with a little bit of a discussion. So that's our outline. So the broader project that we have that we're engaged in, we're looking at a platform like STEM Ed Hub and trying to think of ways that we could semi-automate or automate the aggregation of resources that are related to STEM education research. And one of those key resources are research data sets. And the primary hook to being able to identify and locate a research data set that has been shared is through a digital object identifier. And so the fellowship that we have is really kind of a narrower slice of that larger project. We had to ask an important question, which is, do researchers in the domain of STEM education research cite data using DOIs? Because we need those DOIs to be able to aggregate their content. And so we wanted to ask that question before we did other work. And so, of course, STEM is science, technology, engineering, and math. DOI is digital object identifier, just a couple of terms that I'm sure that most of the people on this call are familiar with, but just in case you aren't. And so basically what we did was we took a sample of 12 prominent journals in STEM education research, and we went to the websites for those journals, and we looked up their author instructions, and starting from the perspective of the author who's submitting a paper and maybe also submitting data or depositing data, you know, what instructions are being given to the author about data and about citing data? And also the context of not just the author instructions, but the broader funder policies, the publisher policy, if they have one, and then the specific journal policy relating to data. So that was the first thing we did, was basically going and doing a kind of a qualitative text analysis of those policies that are presented to the authors. The second thing that we did was we looked at all of the articles that were published by these 12 journals in the year 2017. And we looked at all of the citations of all of those articles and narrowed down the ones that had DOIs in their structured metadata in the Web of Science. And then we queried DataCite to see what types of resources were being cited, okay? And so we'll present the results of that. But just to give you a spoiler alert, to answer our question, do researchers cite their data using DOIs in STEM education research? I'm afraid to say that they don't. But let's walk back now and talk a little bit about why it would be important for them to consider doing it and why data citation is important. And I think probably the seminal document here would be the Joint Declaration on Data Citation Principles, which really kind of lays out a manifesto, if you will, for why data should be cited. So the first is importance, the importance of data. So data being considered a first-class scholarly citizen. And so the 411 data citation principles talk about how data should be accorded the same importance in the scholarly record as published literature. And it should be cited in the references section of the paper. So credit and attribution, data citations should facilitate giving scholarly credit and normative and legal attribution to the contributors to the data. So if you are engaged in scholarship, you're doing work with data, you should get credit for that, especially if you're producing a data set that can be reused and used for further research. So evidence, obviously this is just good scientific practice. You think of the scientific method, you need the data to be able to reproduce the results of the research, to be able to verify it. And citing a data set, whether it's your own data set that you've produced or someone else's data set that you're using, is part of that chain of evidence to be able to reproduce research. Data citations should be unique. So in the particular identifier that we're looking at is a digital object identifier, and they are indeed unique. They're not reused, they're not duplicated. There's only ever one DOI for a data set or other scholarly object. Another principle is the principle of access, which is that data citations should be used to facilitate access to the data themselves and associated metadata, documentation, code, not just for humans who are reading papers, but also for machines to be able to make informed use of the reference data. Persistence, so this kind of goes with uniqueness in that the citation should include an identifier that persists even beyond the lifespan of the data. So if you have a DOI to a data set, for example, and that data are deaccessioned for some reason, the recommended practice is to have a deaccession notice or some record that still maintains an anchor for the data set, at least to prove its existence. Number 7 is the specificity and verifiability. And so the idea here is that a data citation should be very specific in terms of associating a claim that is made in an article or in a paper and the data that supports that claim. So this could include provenance and fixity to prove that what version of the data were used in the research, and fixity to verify that the data haven't been altered or changed over time. And so this data citation in terms of the specificity is really about kind of granularity. It's about for temporal data, identifying a particular time slice and the version and so on, again, to support the verifiability of a claim. And then last but not least, the interoperability and flexibility. The idea that there are different citation practices in different domains, and the data citation should be flexible to accommodate those different practices, but they shouldn't be so flexible that they compromise the interoperability of the data citation practice across communities. And I think that's something that we're seeing with the STEM education research domain. So the Joint Declaration of Data Citation Principles are foundational. More recently, the FAIR principles, making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, have been getting more attention, and rightly so. And among the FAIR principles, there are really these 5 that relate to data citation. The first being that metadata and data are assigned a globally unique and persistent identifier. So for example, a DOI. just like is suggested by the Force 11 principles. The metadata should clearly and explicitly include the identifier of the data they describe. And so in our case, where we were retrieving metadata from Web of Science, it was key for us that those metadata records included the DOI, the identifier for the data or for the scholarly object that they describe. So it's not enough just to have it, presented as plain text as a part of the article or as included in the manuscript, but to actually have it be a part of the structured metadata. And then the last one under findability is that the metadata are registered or indexed in a searchable resource. So in our case, the searchable resource was Web of Science. And then the first principle under accessibility is that metadata and data are retrievable by their identifier using a standardized communications protocol. So in our study, we looked at DOIs and we used HTTP as the communication protocol. And this is the most common practice, certainly. And then last, under interoperability, that metadata and data should include qualified references to other metadata and data. And so in our situation, where we're looking at an article and the citations that are part of the references section of that article, and then they refer to other objects. And in our case, we're looking for data. And in an ideal scenario, that would all be spelled out in machine actionable and human readable, that relationship between the work and what is being cited. And then ideally, it would be two ways, so that if the paper was citing the data set was also able to reference back to the article. And this just increases discoverability and formalizes that relationship. So if someone finds the data first, they can dereference it to the article. If they find the article first, they can dereference it to the cited data set. So these FAIR principles. And with this kind of a setup for why data citation is important, I'll turn it over to my colleague Lauren to talk about what the current practice and attitude is in the STEM education research community.
Thank you, Mike. So we are working in the STEM education research domain. Part of that is contextual in the sense that that's what Anne and I, that's the area we work in. But it's also, if you think about it, a well-funded, relatively speaking, and I guess communicated or high visibility area for research. But when you look at it, and for those of us who are working in this space, it's STEM education research is really a wide amalgamation of a bunch of different disciplines. And so being evaluators and researchers in that space, Anne and I are in a position to see kind of across the whole domain of STEM education research. We work with people who have lots of different types of backgrounds. And we also, and Anne can hop in if she would like to give more information, but we also happen to have a Science Gateways platform that would allow the type of data citation and sharing that we're talking about here. And yet at the same time, we were seeing that kind of practice wasn't happening. And so we were interested in understanding, we know it's bad, but how bad is it? And from there, how do we improve it? So our first step really together as a team with Michael and the Libraries and School of Information Studies was to understand how bad is it? And as a kind of amalgamated discipline, what's the current state of affairs in STEM education research? And so just as a context, you can see that, typically the people who are working in research in STEM education are folks who are trained in or looking in teacher development. They might be cognitive science researchers. They might be sociologists. They might focus on human development. They might focus on learning technology and design. They might be what we call discipline-based researchers, which is folks who maybe have a PhD in, say, geology, but have transitioned to do research in how to teach geology to undergrad students, for example. They might be communication of science folks. So there's all this different type of background and domain and space where that's all considered STEM education research. And those settings for that research can be school settings, so PK-12 school, they could be higher ed, they could be post-secondary education settings, museums, homes. There's STEM education research going on in what I would call a professional work setting, so engineering firms. How do engineers or, for example, health scientists work together, and how do we study how they learn to collaborate together? So that's under the umbrella of STEM education research. So that's kind of the big picture of what the whole totality of STEM education research entails. And I will let Michael move the slide forward. Okay, and so preparation, right? And so we know that there's problems with data citation practices, even data use, practices. So some potential reasons why that may be, if we're just thinking about what kinds, where these problems may stem from. Researchers and funders, so both, really are not coming from a standard training or professionalization background. So all the different types of research contexts, but also research types, so STEM education areas, really are drawing from folks with very different backgrounds and very different ways of understanding research. So we can be talking about people, like I said, who have discipline-based education research backgrounds. So they have, are already maybe established researchers in a STEM field, so an engineer, or they're geologists, or they are chemists, and they transition to doing research in education in that area as well. Folks who may have trained up and have PhDs in humanities or sociology or other social science backgrounds. Anne and I are evaluators, and many of the cohorts who work with us may have improvement science backgrounds, improvement science degrees. So they're looking at systems thinking in how to improve systems, or in engineering learning in a sense. And sometimes, there are very different professionalization and training opportunities for those people. And so the whole idea of a STEM education research as a discipline is maybe not the best way to think about it. So understanding the reality of that kind of lack of discipline or lack of professionalization will help us think about what solutions, or how to improve the state of affairs in the future. Can you advance the slide, Michael? And so the previous slide that talked about kind of the lack of professionalization, or maybe the lack of a standard discipline, really gets to the idea of a bit of an epistemic crisis in the field that's been happening ever since, sometime around the 90s. There was a large kind of postmodern turn in education research, where we really started to question the idea of objectivity. And that lovely revolution has not really ever condensed into a common understanding or a common philosophical idea about what data is and what high quality data look like, and how we can be ethical in our treatment of data. For example, a lot of the research that we're talking about here is human subjects research. Who owns what data, and how we use it ethically, and what the even legal understandings and ramifications of data use and sharing and citation are. Now, that is not to say that this problem is insurmountable. There are plenty of other human subjects research fields that are much farther ahead of STEM education research in this area. And so I think one of the maybe solutions that we might discuss later is to think about what they're doing. But for the time being, one of the contextual issues to consider here is that we have a lot of different epistemologies at play within individual researchers, or even across researchers. And I say that within individual researchers because many, as I mentioned, of STEM education researchers are folks who may have a PhD in a hard science, chemistry, for example, or physics is a good example. And then during the course of their professional career in academia, for example, turn to education and research. And so their training, they never would have received training in social science research methods. And so their epistemic shift actually ends up happening, usually late in career. So you've got folks who, even within the same researcher, are kind of fighting with this idea of how do we think about data? How do we think about data in one domain where I was trained, chemistry, versus, education research, which is where I'm working now. And so that kind of warring happening, kind of philosophical wars happening even within people, really reduces the amount of energy, I think, for imagining the potential of what we can do if we, for the field, if we begin to develop better practices around data use and data sharing and data citation. So, an example of this just is, many of you know that NSF created I don't know that, I think Michael knows the policy, but, right around 2007, 8, 9, really started to encourage everyone, or mandate that everyone have a data management plan for NSF funded work. And I was on a panel evaluation, or a proposal evaluation panel around that time. It was probably as late as 2011. And the directions that the panel received to review these proposals was to look and see if there was a data management plan, if it existed. If it existed, we checked the box, and that was it. And so there really wasn't the energy to imagine what a good data management plan could be, and how we might even evaluate it as a education research community. So that's just one example of kind of the cost of lack of clarity in the field. Next slide. This is, so I don't know if you want to jump in here, Michael, but here's kind of where we started, right? So this is the list of journals that we started with. I will give you a little bit of information about how we came up with this list. It wasn't, there was no underlying methodology other than we wanted it to be as representative of the breadth of STEM education research as we could include. And we wanted it to be a mix of what I would call very high impact journals and maybe second tier. So, most people who are operating and publishing in STEM education research should be publishing in one of these journals. Even if they're not able to get to the highest tier every time, they should also be publishing in a couple of these other ones. So in that sense, it should be fairly representative. It's missing a couple, some of these, like Journal of Research and Science Teaching, are nominally focused on school settings, but they actually do publish outside of school or informal research as well. Other than that, we're pretty representative of the whole group.
Yeah, and so we also have a diversity of publishers. And I think we hit the S, the T, the E, and the M of STEM, at least with one journal representing each. The other thing is that, we wanted to make sure that the journals that we selected were indexed by Web of Science, and that they at least minted DOIs for their articles. Because if they weren't at least doing those two things, we really weren't going to be able to find out if their authors and if the platforms were supporting DOIs for data. So I'll take over from here and drive. So what we did is we looked at these 12 journals. We looked at the author instructions and looked for how are they telling authors who are submitting articles to these journals to handle their data, in terms of sharing their data, depositing in a repository or supplemental information. And then are they giving authors clear direction on citing data? None of them require it, but they all have different, many of them have different degrees of how strongly they encourage it or how they support it through their documentation. So these policies, Lauren mentioned the OSTP memo that was the increasing access to results of federally funded research. This is the Holmgren memo that basically said that all U.S. federal funding agencies that have an R&D budget of over 100 million need to have public access plans that address sharing of research outputs, publications, making them as openly accessible as possible, and data as well. And so this filtered down through the agencies and manifest itself as requirements for data management plans that are submitted with grant proposals. And this is something that I think, at least for all funded research, our researchers have some awareness of. The idea that my funder expects me to share my data, and it should be done, depending on which agencies guidelines you're looking at, in an open access repository. Many of them specifically require things like ORCID identifiers as your researcher identifier, or a DOI for your data set. And so there's that context of the government policy. Then the National Science Foundation in particular, I just provide one example in the link, the slides will be shared, in terms of how that translates through to the largest funder of STEM education research in the United States, at least. And then there are also publisher policies. So Wiley and Springer in particular have fairly robust publisher policies and support for editors, for reviewers, for authors in sharing data, recommending repositories, citation style guides for how to cite data, and those kinds of things. In all cases, the publisher policy is more yielding and more general than the individual journal editorial policies and author guidelines. So when you go from the publisher to the individual journal, the journal has its own author guidelines and editorial policies that fit within the publisher policy. And in many cases, they reference each other and use similar text. One of the reasons why it's interesting to note the publishers of these journals is that one thing that we found as we were looking at these author guidelines is that many of them included the same boilerplate text. They were kind of all starting from the same place. And so depending on what that level of support was and that, text from the publisher really seems to dramatically impact the text that goes into the journal's editorial policy. And so what I want to do, I don't want to belabor this, but I'd like to take you through 5 examples from 5 different publishers that hit science, technology, engineering, and math, and kind of just show you kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly as it relates to author guidelines and data sharing and data citation. So player 1 is the Journal of Engineering Education. This is a Wiley title. And if you look at its author guidelines, which are linked there at the bottom of the page, you'll find that there really are none. So they don't really mention data or sharing data or citing data. What they do is they reference the standards for reporting on empirical social science research in AERA publications, which is a standard that is behind a paywall. We had access to it at Purdue, so I checked it out. And if you scroll all the way down to the last page in section 7 under ethics in reporting, you'll see this text here that's on the screen, which really just says that authors should maintain data in a way that a hypothetical researcher with a copy of the data can reproduce the results. So really not terrific guidance here, certainly not encouraging authors to share their data and to cite their data. So that was number 1. Player 2 is the Journal of Chemical Education. This is put out by the American Chemical Society. And I should say that these journals are not necessarily representative of science education or technology education. These are just the ones that I picked from each publisher in each field for a variety of guidelines. So the Journal of Chemical Education does a little bit better. If you go through their author guidelines and you get down to the part about supporting information, which is supplementary data files, they do explicitly mention raw data, and they say that it can be hosted on the author's website and that you can include the URL for the website in your description of your supplementary files. and that the URL may be provided in a citation in the manuscript. So no mention of identifiers or DOIs or repositories or anything like this, but at least a mention of data as supporting information and saying that you may cite it. So there's an allowance for it, but not an encouragement. So player 3 is life sciences education. This is put out by the American Society for Cell Biology. It is a fairly short statement, but they actually do address sharing materials and data in their information for authors. They say that databases may be linked as supplemental material. They do say that authors are encouraged to share raw data with the caution about sharing human data should be consistent with IRB and protocols. So not a whole lot of information here. The focus here really seems to be more on the biological specimens, the cell lines and such, as opposed to digital data. But it gets a little bit of treatment as part of the supporting information. Okay, so now we're getting to some better examples. The International Journal of Science Education is put out by Taylor and Francis, and it actually has quite a bit of a nice statement. Again, not a requirement, but an encouragement, saying that in the instructions for authors, there is a checklist, which I think is helpful because sometimes these author guidelines can be pretty extensive. And if you're submitting a manuscript, you just want to know, like, what are the boxes I need to check? Indeed, one of those boxes is a data availability statement, where they talk about the data that supports the results or the analysis that are presented in the paper. Should be you should describe in a statement how people can access and under what conditions the data can be accessed. And they specifically mention DOI. On the same checklist, they also include data deposition, and they encourage authors to deposit their data in a recognized repository. They say that when the author submits their manuscript, they should provide the DOI or a pre-reserved DOI for the data set. And then last but not least, in the checklist also addresses supplemental online material, which can also be a data set. They have this data sharing policy, which is in front of you now, where authors are encouraged to share and make their data open, again, to deposit in a repository. They encourage using repositories that mint DOIs for their data and have a long-term preservation plan. They're encouraged to cite data sets referenced in the article, and again, provide the data availability statement. They have a style guide. Taylor and Francis uses APA version 7, and they actually provide an example of a data citation with the DOI. So that's terrific. They say that when you submit your manuscript, if you reply that there's a data set associated with the paper, you'll be asked to provide a DOI with it or a hyperlink. And that you make that available as part of the review. That said, they do say that the data are not formally peer reviewed, but they're there for context for the reviewers. And so in addition to the instructions for the authors, Taylor and Francis at the publisher level has documentation enhancing your article with supplemental material. And they talk about specifically about data, increasing the discoverability of the paper, that data can be cited and that enhances your research impact, that it satisfies funder requirements, that data are preserved, and that they make the point that papers that have data are actually downloaded more. So that's terrific. They go on to have other guidelines around choosing a data repository, and also templates for the data availability statement. In articles, the data availability statement in this journal is placed in the text of the manuscript immediately before the references. And then last but not least, if you submit data to the journal as a supplemental file, they will automatically deposit it in Figshare and get you a DOI for it, and then relate your paper to the data set automatically. So those are some, I think, some quality guidelines there. All right, last but not least is the Mathematics Education Research Journal. This is from Springer. And the submission guidelines for authors have declarations saying that all manuscripts must contain a declaration for the availability of data and material and the availability of code related to the paper, so addressing software as well. They give encouragement for authors to archive their data in data repositories whenever it's possible. Under the ethical responsibilities for authors, the journal says that upon request, authors should be prepared to send relevant documentation or data in order to verify the validity of the results. They also address data transparency and a list of data repositories. They explicitly say that data sets that have DOIs may be cited in the references, and that they should include the minimum amount of information required by recommended by DataCite. So the research data policies of the publisher of Springer are also quite extensive, pages and pages and pages of information. And they have an email address that you can email someone from the publisher who will help you select the data repository, prepare your data, share your data, etc. So I just wanted to give you a quick overview of some examples of what information is presented to authors when they submit manuscripts and what policies they're looking at. That was part one. Part two is the actual citation data collection and analysis. Okay, so having looked at what the publishers and the journals are telling authors to do, now we're going to look and see, based on the data analysis, what are they actually doing. And so what we did was we used the CADRE platform to query the Web of Science data set, which is huge. And it was really great to have CADRE to be able to perform this analysis. Each query for each journal for us ran in about 10 minutes or 15 minutes. I'm sure that any of those queries would have tanked my laptop. So it's great to have that computational platform. And so what we did was we queried Web of Science and the core collection data set to retrieve all references from all articles from all issues from the 12 journals that were published in 2017. And so we pulled those down, and then we performed analysis to determine how many of those citations included DOIs, structured metadata. And then we used we took those APIs, took those DOIs and queried the API of DataCite to look them up and to retrieve their metadata records. And then we examined those metadata records of the DOIs from DataCite to determine the type of resource that was being referenced. So DataCite in its metadata schema has a controlled list of different resource types that include dataset, data paper, model, software, and others. Those are the ones that we were mostly interested in. And so we did this, did all of this number crunching. These are the results that we have. So broken down by journal, publisher, the number of articles in 2017, how many total citations, and then how many of those citations have DOIs. And then kind of the sad part, which is the last column, which is the number of DataCite DOIs that reference data. And the result is basically very, 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 very clear that researchers in STEM education research are not citing data, certainly as it would be indicated by the DOIs from DataCite from these 12 journals. Just for point of reference, all of the citations, so we had, let's see, 17,245 DOIs out of 49,107 citations. So what that means is about 35% of the citations had DOIs, and of those, a smaller proportion were DataCite DOIs, which were the ones that we looked at. So 0. That's our main outcome. And so there's it was good that we found that out, because we were thinking that we might use that functionality to the DOI functionality of DataCite to be able to identify and aggregate data sets that relate to STEM education research based on the journals that are prominent in the domain. And we have other tactics that we'll try to get at that, but this will clearly not be one of them. So just by way of a little bit of discussion, we do have another step that we want to take. We've been looking at DataCite DOIs, which are really just kind of a fraction of the DOIs that we have, the 17,000 DOIs that we have. The majority of them are from Crossref. And so we want to do this analysis also against Crossref's API, where they also have a resource type, and they have a data set as an option. So it's possible that we may find some data citations using Crossref, but I'm guessing if we do, we're going to find a similar result where there are maybe not zero, but very few. And so this kind of begs the question, why don't STEM education researchers share their data and cite their data? And Lauren talked a little bit about this, the idea of human subject research. There are there's less kind of open data sharing, and maybe more of the data sharing is happening through the data availability statements. But there are problems with the data availability statements in that they really don't align very well with FAIR principles, and they certainly don't align with the Force 11 and the Joint Declaration on the data citation principles. And so there's some thinking that can be done here in terms of registering data, not necessarily making it publicly available, but registering it and getting a DOI for the data. And then maybe some thought around trying to take data availability statements and make them fair, make them machine actionable, and help establish those relationships where even if a researcher doesn't have immediate access to the data, they can still cite the data, and they can still be able to uniquely and persistently be able to locate it and to access it. I think that it's really clear that funders and the publishers and the journals can raise their expectations in terms of encouraging their authors to share their data and cite their data. Of the 5 examples, I think 2 of them I thought were pretty decent. The other 3 could stand improvement. And I'll say that the direction that's given to authors is not as clear as it could be. So those are some closing thoughts that I wanted to share. I wanted to encourage Lauren and Anne, if you have other questions or things to discuss, jump in.
I would love to leave some time for questions, but I would just echo what Michael, I think, first said about this discussion is, we were as a group really thinking about how, maybe the issue is just that we need to centralize finding, right? So we were talking about creating a system and a kind of centralized way to aggregate existing data sets, but we're really happy and glad that we did this background research here using CADRE to find out, well, guess what? There really isn't much or anything to aggregate at this point. And so, maybe our, solutions to this problem are deeper than finding data sets. They happen to be probably more in the actual practice of dealing and using with data and how we talk about and use data in our field. So.
Right, there's nowhere to go but up here, I think, is what our ultimate finding is. So, Anne, anything from you?
I don't have too much to add. I guess I will say that we mentioned STEM Ed Hub, and it's a science gateway, and we've had the ability on STEM Ed Hub to create assigned DOIs, and we've advertised it a little bit, and people are kind of excited about the ability, but no one has really harnessed it. And I think they're mainly excited to use it for reports and maybe materials, but not for data sets. And I think, part of what I need to do is for our science gateway is to encourage people to publish their data sets more and show them how they can do that.
Yes, yes. Okay, great. Good. So thanks everyone for your attention. And if anybody has any questions, we're happy to take them now with the 10 minutes or so that we have left in the hour.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Yeah, we do have time for several questions. Please and ask. Well, Mike, I have a comment myself.
Sure.
Because it's very interesting to us because CADRE as a platform ourselves are trying to create these DOI assignment to dataset that people query on our platform. But seeing your results, I'm sort of started realizing it's not a common practice. It's just a feature people ask a lot, but it's not actually being used to enough extent. I'm just curious because right now our plan is simply produce persistent code packages and data packages, archives, and just let them be searchable through DOI. But you're referring specifically in this case to DataCite here, which is I think a dedicated service for searchable data sets. Should we? I guess my question is, if that's sort of the standard way to go, should we considering sort of complying with their API and somehow get integrated?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Shiran. I mean, I think it's really important that these results do not get generalized outside of STEM education research. So we're looking at a really specific field. And in other fields, data citation as a practice is more commonly adopted, and DOIs are more of the standard. So I wouldn't want to discourage you from persisting your queries, because I think that's an important part of being able to reproduce results. And there's a whole interesting conversation around what it means to persist, to cite dynamic data, right? So I mean, the idea is that if you persist the query, and then the backend data gets updated, maybe with another year's worth of data, that the results would be different. And I think there are a lot of interesting and valid use cases for that. As far as whether you use DataCite, Crossref, there are a number of different agencies. DataCite began its life, with a focus on research data. Now their DOIs are used for other kinds of content, but they still maintain that focus and that the engagement with the research data community. And I think that the key things are really just to make sure you're going back to principles. When you're engineering your system, to look at the Force 11 declaration, think about the FAIR principles, and leverage the structured metadata. So establish the relationships between your article that's citing your query. And likewise, if someone is in the CADRE platform and encounters the query, to know that this query relates back to the paper or to other digital scholarly objects, like maybe the software, for example. So I think the one thing that's great about the Web of Science data is that it's structured. We were talking earlier about the Microsoft Academic Graph, and that's also a very powerful and huge data set. But it wasn't useful to us because the citation metadata wasn't structured. It was mostly ascertained through machine learning techniques and analyzing the full text of the article and scraping the citations from it, which for sources that are not indexed with structured metadata is tremendously useful. But for our study, it wasn't comprehensive or accurate enough. So that would really just be my point would be, look at the structured metadata and fully utilize it, and try to follow the best practices as much as you're able to, especially in engineering a system, because how you engineer the system influences how people use the system. Kind of like, the author guidelines influence the behavior of the researchers. If your system has the capability, to mint DOIs and to create these kinds of relationships, and you leverage them, that will move the needle further in terms of increasing the adoption of DOIs and citing data than all of the other kinds of engagement that we can do that's kind of like soft engagement, talking to researchers directly, talking to labs and centers and that kind of thing. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, that's quite helpful. We still have time for more questions.
Hello. I was wondering if you looked into best practices for depositing data, and what would you recommend?
So I mean, it really depends on your context and your specific situation, but in general, the depositing the data in a repository and referencing it using the DOI, I think is probably a good practice, if not the best practice. And giving that specific instruction to researchers, I think, is helpful. One thing I think that with the author guidelines is that they're just, some of them just really aren't as clear. They reference these other standards, or, they say things, it's almost like if you could make a really simple statement of, you're a researcher, deposit your data in a repository, cite the DOI in the references section of your paper. This works the best with the current infrastructure that we have, and I think does the best to support things like, the findability, accessibility, interoperability, reusability of the FAIR principles, and as well as the joint declaration. So I think those would be some suggestions, but of course there are a lot of nuances depending on what area of research you're in, what your use case is, what protections you need for your data and those kinds of things.
Thank you.
Thanks.
One last question, anyone?
We're just about to the top of the hour.
Well, what is the best way to cite CADRE data?
The
CADRE data.
Ha! That's a great question. I mean, Sharon was just talking about citing specific queries, which I think is really interesting. Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I mean, I do think that you can cite a platform if it is integral to how you get your results. If it's part of your reproducibility of your research findings. Also, the specific data sets that CADRE hosts, could and should be cited. Those would be the things that I would start with.
And thank you for the question. I guess I should also jump in here. We are still building our package system, which we hope in the future will help you cite. It will create a citable DOI, which we are still building, of the exact search result you receive from our platform. But Mike just raised an interesting question. Some of the queries might be dynamic, so a lot of cases archiving query instead of the search result itself might be more efficient. So that's another interesting direction we should definitely consider. But yes, the next milestone for CADRE platform is really enabling DOI assignment to your code and your data packages. And once that's ready, you should be able to cite your own data results directly.
Very cool.
All right, I think we're running out of time. Thanks again for the for our fellow team from Purdue. And we hope you enjoy the whole entire installment of our webinar series. And we are planning to bring in new exciting webinar series next year as well. So stay tuned. This is not the end of the activities that we will be bringing to you from CADRE platform. Thank you.
Thank you all. Merry holidays, Happy New Year, and best of luck through the pandemic for you.
Thank you.
Have a good one.